Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Abigail Maines. I am the Chief Revenue Officer for HiddenLayer and honored to be the moderator for the panel today. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for what I promise will be an incredibly pragmatic session that is obviously incredibly timely and relevant. Before I jump into the agenda, I'm really excited to be joined with such an expert and experienced group of panelists that I'm going to introduce to you one by one, starting with David Veuve. David is with Databricks. He joined Databricks in 2019 as the head of security field engineering. He and his team work globally to help customers safely deploy data and AI solutions by understanding how they fit into existing security architectures and collecting and sharing best practices. David has been in InfoSec for 16 years, and in his prior job at Splunk as a principal security strategist, he wrote the most widely used security detection app for the platform. David has spoken about security data science at numerous conferences, including the Splunk User Conference and DEF CON AI Village. Thank you for joining us today, David. Next up is Steve Zalewski from S3 Consulting. Steve is a board advisor to security companies and VC firms. He provides guidance on market fit and direction. In addition, his practice provides retained CISO and security advisory services to clients to address program management, design, assessment, due diligence, and board reporting. Steve was former CISO at Levi Strauss & Company and has held multiple senior security positions at Pacific Gas and Electric and Kaiser Permanente. He has also been issued multiple patents in data protection and multi-processor operating system design. Steve also co-hosts the CISO Series Defense in Depth podcast. Thank you for joining us today, Steve. Now, joining us, we have two folks from HiddenLayer. I'm going to start with Malcolm Harkins. Malcolm is the Chief Security and Trust Officer for HiddenLayer. He is responsible for enabling business growth through trusted infrastructure, systems, and best practices. Malcolm is responsible for peer outreach and activities to drive improvement across the world in understanding of cyber risks, as well as best practices to manage and mitigate those risks. Previously, Malcolm was the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cylance, and Malcolm has also been the Vice President and Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Intel. And finally, we're thrilled to be joined with one of the main authors of the Threat Landscape Report that we issued earlier today, Eoin Wickens. Eoin is our Technical Resource Director. He works as a leading researcher in securing artificial intelligence systems. He has previously worked in threat research, threat intelligence, and malware reverse engineering, and has been published over a dozen times, including co-authoring a book on cyber threat intelligence, focusing on Cobalt Strike. Eoin has spoken at conferences such as B-Side San Francisco, DEF CON AI Village, LabCon, and 44Con. And really importantly, he proudly supports the Irish cybersecurity community as a South Chapter member lead of Cyber Ireland. Thank you all for being with us today. Now, a little housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share an electronic viewing of it with you following the session. Questions are definitely encouraged. You can ask those via the Q&A link on your screen, and we will address them after our prepared comments. Now, as we head into the panel discussion, I want to share a couple of very important statistics that you'll see right in the front of the report that kind of ground this conversation on why it's so important. Number one, on average, our survey respondents told us they have over 1,600 AI models in production in their organizations. Probably not surprising to some of you, 98% of IT leaders consider at least some of those AI assets to be mission critical to their business success. That could be cost avoidance, cost minimization, it could be revenue generation, it could be competitive differentiation. And staggering, and really what we'll spend a lot of time talking about today, is that 77% of our respondents have already had an AI breach to one of those systems. Finally, there are four main things that we hope that you're going to get from the session today. Number one, an understanding of the current risks and vulnerabilities of AI models and systems. Number two, the types of attacks being exploited by threat actors today in the wild, in the real world. Number three, advancements in the security for AI category from offensive research through the implementation of defensive systems. And then finally, and I think what is really important from my perspective that you get from this session are really practical steps that you can take today, tomorrow, in the remainder of this quarter and this year to protect your organizations such that you can continue to drive innovation in your organization, but by doing so in a very secure way. So with that, I'd like to really just kick it off to the panel and start with part one. I should also say the way this webinar is going to work is we're going to go through the 4 main parts of the threat report that you should have received today or will be receiving soon. Number one, the first part is risks related to the use of Gen AI systems, LLM systems. I'm sure this is on the top of mind for many of you on today's call. So to my panel, I would say, and maybe I'll start with you, Eoin. What are some of the top risks that you have seen both with our customer base as well as in your research around adopting LLMs? How do we do that in a secure manner?
Yeah, thanks, Ab. It's a great question. Today, there exists a whole host of different kind of issues with LLMs. Things like the OWASP top 10 for LLMs is aiming to highlight a number of these. The 3 most primary ones that I would say in my I guess research would be number 1, hallucinations. The veracity of information is incredibly important, and as we start to transition to LLMs being the font of knowledge and so on in the future, we need to be able to trust that what they provide us is accurate. The things like Wikipedia and everything, we're able to somewhat peer review and basically through numbers get to a truthful source of information. But with LLMs, that's getting increasingly difficult, where they might make up false citations or provide false information. Maybe it be around an election or something similar. We can often think of these as like an unreliable narrator. Outside of that, I would say another major thing is we're starting to see LLMs be incorporated into the enterprise and enterprise organizations is data leakage. So basically the leakage of, well, if we think of LLMs as the vast result of computation over a really large data set, we can actually still often access members of this data set through the LLM itself. So we could get it to spit out information it was trained on, in other words. So when we think of models that have been trained on personally identifiable information or internal data, such as on your Jira or Confluence, that is then accessible, we have to think of these as essentially a new attack surface or a data plane, I guess. And yeah, especially now that we're starting to use this to be able to say, okay, well, inside my environment, tell me what hosts are running this information or running this software, what data is stored, give me data on these employees or what have you. And as we start to have more of these accessible endpoints with, I guess, looser access control, this is going to be more of a potential hindrance. And like lastly, and I know I've been speaking a lot already out the gate, but prompt injection, I would say, is probably another one. Initially, very storm in a teacup kind of a problem. It was, we could get it to say something, hurtful or mean, but today that's starting to become way more of an issue. When we consider things like LLMs being hooked up to different services and plugins and products and really serving as the main driving force in a lot of products, this is going to become an increasingly worrying thing, especially with the eve of indirect prompt injection and prompt injection through different image formats, different data formats such as image and so on. But those are my main 3.
Thank you, Eoin. I'm sure, David, you're speaking with a lot of customers in the field in your role around LLMs and Gen AI adoption. What are the top things that what are the top questions maybe that you're hearing from customers that they're asking Databricks on how to provide some guidance so that they can adopt these things super quickly, but in a secure manner?
Yeah, we talk to customers about this all the time, and I think there's 2 categories, and I'm going to buck the trend of enumerating specific risks. Although, Eoin, you had a very good, very kind of traditional or like very modern AI-focused set of risks. I look at it from a slightly different perspective of there is a lot of the risks that occur are really around reliability and kind of control of the status and quality of the model, which is convenient for us in the security world because it's also the same things that the actual business teams building out these LLMs care about. They care about the degradation of the quality of a hosted LLM in the same way that you care about it from a security perspective, because it can be graded for a variety of reasons. They can care about kind of control and the privacy risks, things like that, just in the same way that we in the security world probably do. And one of the things that I think is also kind of comforting to me about looking at these risks is they're kind of, I look at risks almost in 2 categories, being risks that it requires a PhD in computer science to address, and risks that humble country security professionals such as myself can do something around. And most of the things that fall into that second category are things that security teams have known for a long time, and they talk about how do we deal with the world of AI and ML models and LLMs, all this type of stuff, as if it's totally brand new and they are walking into it unprepared for anything. But things like patching and supply chain control and code control, release management, all these things are things we've dealt with for a long time in a normal world, and they apply just as much into the world of AI models as well.
Absolutely. Malcolm, over to you, because I know you have a strong point of view on some of, we've seen this before with new technologies, and then, sort of fighting to catch up from a control perspective. What would you add to what David just said?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at other technology transitions we've gone through over the years, some typical response, and we've seen this from a lot of organizations. First, when ChatGPT and stuff like that was released, they block and they create a policy and say you can't use it. I can tell you straight out that stuff doesn't work. All you do is drive your users and business away from you, and you lose the understanding of what they're trying to do, which means you lose the way to kind of shape the path and manage the risk. The other, failure we've seen historically that I think, again, we're probably experiencing to some extent is people waiting to implement controls because they, quote unquote, have no evidence of attack, or they don't see obvious exploitation that's occurred with the AI that they are already using. Now, that type of, I'll say, risk rationalization makes it worse. All you're doing is kicking the can down the road when you can be taking action now to manage and mitigate the risk. And then the third thing is thinking your existing controls manage the risk, because they don't. They weren't built for the file types. They weren't built for the model types. Doesn't matter if you got CrowdStrike Sentinel-1, it's not going to scan the model. It's not going to prevent the execution of malicious code in it. Doesn't matter if you got Qualys, Tenable, and you got Vuln scans. They're not going to look for data poison. They're not going to look for these things. Your web application firewall on your external web app is not going to control for the risk of a prompt injection or other things that are going to interact with the model to do things to it. So you have to look beyond the traditional controls we've been using, because it's a new tech stack and there's a new interaction. And so you have to control for it differently. But as David said, similar concepts apply, but you have to use newer technologies, a new approach to manage that risk.
Thank you. Steve, anything to add on this one?
So I'm going to take a slightly different view, which was there's the attack concerns. But for a lot of us, what we're trying to do is evaluate secure versus safe. Because for our companies, what we're trying to do is not understand what the technical problem is, but it's why do we need to do this to be able to allow the company to succeed. And so what I look at is unintended consequences is probably my biggest concern, because I want the company to be able to generate revenue, and I need to put a bubble of protection around the company's ability to do that right now for unintended consequences, as opposed to directly worrying about attack types for certain industries.
Great. Thank you. And we're going to continue this dialogue, and we're going to talk about the bubble options here as we go. So thank you all very much. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask something around deepfakes. We are in an election year in the United States. There's a ton of information around deepfakes. Can you just kind of explain what a deepfake is, talk about potentially how to spot one, and just, what can the industry, or what should the folks on the call be thinking about how we can minimize their level of disruption, both from a public policy perspective, but even in our own organizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. Deepfakes are interesting. I guess to introduce the topic of it is essentially a fake using deep learning, typically to take maybe a picture or a video of myself, for instance, and then create a whole different scene or image that I'm a part of that looks incredibly real or truthful. Spotting these before used to be quite easy. You could kind of tell it looked a bit off. There was, if you use a bit of an astute eye, you'd be able to understand with a certain degree of accuracy that this was fake or not. But today that's starting to change an awful lot. I think with the advances we've made, technologically, where we're starting to see things like entire videos being stitched together that last minutes in length now from a sentence, like we're going to be reaching a point very shortly where with as little as an image for that base material, we'll be able to create disinformation and fake media, especially against pertinent people, and that's going to be quite difficult to spot. We saw recently, the start of February, there was an attack on a bank where I believe it was one of their high-level executives was deepfaked, and it was basically told an employee to transfer, I think, around 25 million out of the bank to an attacker. So spotting these is kind of an open question. We're trying our best to do that. We're trying our best to understand different ways and means and data points to be able to analyze that. But right at this minute, it's something that's very much a worrying concern, I think, going forward, especially in an election year. Because the typical misinformation and disinformation life cycle that we see spin up every 4 years, well, with the US election cycle, that is. I'm based in Ireland, so it's a little bit different. Since that kicks up, this year is going to be quite interesting to watch.
Yeah, I actually think that example that you give in the bank was over a Zoom call, right? So there was actually deepfakes on Zoom with multiple deepfakes.
Yeah, you can actually inject live into a camera feed now. There's tools to do that. I was looking at one last week, actually.
Only for good purposes, though, right? Owen?
Pardon?
Oh, only for not for nefarious purposes, right? Owen?
Yeah, totally not.
Academic research.
So from my CISO panelists, what would your reaction be to that right now in terms of it's very difficult to identify them, it's very difficult to minimize their ability to be disruptive. What kind of controls would you be thinking about in your organizations?
So I'll take that, which was the number one challenge we have from my perspective, obviously, is social engineering attack, right? Which was the ability to generate a digital persona that is indistinguishable from the actual person. And so to attack me and to get me to make a mistake to be able to then penetrate, right? We've weaponized Gen AI incredibly well on the defense. And what we're struggling here is how do we inoculate, right, on my side? So for defensive protection against the offense, and the inoculation is what we're talking about here, ways of being able to now knock it back.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add is if you look at it historically, even if you go back 2-ish, 3-ish years ago, it would take really a lot of resources, likely a nation state actor, in order to do that. You think of the Mission Impossible movies, right? Where Tom Cruise dresses up as somebody else, and you got all that. Now think of this in the digital realm. Now that people are working from home and have all this remote stuff, and you can do it as Eoin mentioned in minutes now. And so that velocity of attack vector and the ease with which somebody could do it, it could be a 5-year-old doing it, not a 45-year-old with a PhD in computer science, to what David talked about. And so it widens the potential actors, even from people just screwing around and creating unintended consequences, to what Steve was mentioning earlier.
Thank you. All right, my last question specific to part 1 of the report is over to you, Malcolm, around data privacy and leakage. Obviously a huge vulnerability component of LLMs. I spend at least 8 hours a day talking about this right now. So given your deep domain expertise here, sort of what are the lessons learned that we have had from privacy leaks like this in the past that could be applied to the adoption of LLMs?
Well, again, I think depending upon how you look at it, in some cases, the implication of a privacy leak, some organizations that have had privacy breaches, despite legal cost and regulatory issues, some folks have had a hard time pinpointing harm to the consumer whose data was leaked. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no harm that can come to them, right? Because if that personal information is leaked, and let's just say it's personal health records, well, medical fraud is a big deal. And getting fake prescriptions and leveraging people's identities and billing purposes and all that type of stuff. So there's a bunch of ways that even just, let's say, a leak of a personal health record information could be quite damaging, not only to the healthcare organization, but to the individual. And as we're using AI in healthcare to improve radiological imaging reading and the efficacy and efficiency. If that leaks, again, there could be manipulations of that, fraud items, forecasting and diagnosis of cancer. And you go, well, who would want to do that? Well, if I'm somebody who's got a cancer drug and I want to drive usage to it, there are people who would, again, overestimate based upon that image analysis to drive use of a drug, right, that they would prescribe. So there's a bunch of ways that that could occur that, again, have implications on the individual, have implications on the organizations.
Sure. Related to that, just as a quick follow-up, what would your advice be as it relates to cross-functional communication with different groups within an organization to try to minimize the disruption of any sort of leak? You know, I'm thinking, what is the CISO's role as it relates to talking with the data science team or the ML engineering team or the software engineering team that's implementing these LLMs today?
Yeah, I think across the board, you have to have, in essence, a netting of data science, security, privacy, other risk domains in the enterprise, legal, and not just legal from the privacy perspective, legal from a discovery perspective, because if you have an incident and you have a probability of getting sued because of it, you have an obligation to preserve it. You've got the SEC stuff now, and all those things are different aspects of legal, right? You need finance folks, because guess what? If you have an issue, you're going to need to spend money, and you're going to need a finance person on your hip so that you can actually activate things. You've got, cyber insurance, and so you've got your team who's doing, corporate risk in that sense. You've got your CIO, you might have your CTO, you might have the business unit general manager, right? So you have to be able to have not only upfront in the risk understanding and definition of controls, a collection of those folks to help you manage the risk, but they're important and critical when it comes to responding to the risk when and if it manifests itself.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So now I'm going to move to part 2 of the report, everybody, which is risk faced by AI system. What you would see when you're reading the report is that we outline 3 major macro types of attacks on AI. Number 1 being adversarial machine learning attacks. So these are attacks against AI models aimed to alter the behavior of the model, evade it, or steal the underlying technology. Number 2, which we've already talked quite a bit about this morning, is generative AI system attacks. So these are attacks against the filters and restrictions intended to also evade, steal, alter the behavior of the LLM. And then thirdly and finally, and we'll spend a lot of time on the supply chain attacks, or attacks against ML artifacts and platforms with the intention of arbitrary code execution and the delivery of traditional malware, and obviously disruption of the digital supply chain. So I'm going to start with Eoin. Eoin is I'm super excited to have you here, Eoin. You're probably one of the top 2-3 people in the world on some of these types of attacks. Can you just share with us sort of, in the wild adversarial attacks that we've seen at HiddenLayer? And I think that's important because we want to make sure people understand that these attacks are happening now and what those actually look like. I have a note here that we can talk about ByteDance and OpenAI. That was one just in December. But, what are some examples of sort of what we're seeing in the wild?
Cool. Yeah, I think you covered the main categories really nicely there. Be it to evade, bypass, or steal a model. I think stealing a model is a really nice one maybe to hone in on, especially since you mentioned the ByteDance scenario. So I think, was it late last year, ByteDance had their access to OpenAI's models cut off because they were essentially using them to I think, generate and create their own, or fine-tune their own models, if I'm not mistaken. Basically, this is you can replicate a model very easily and very conveniently by sending a series of requests to a model. In fact, there's actual full-on frameworks to be able to achieve this. And often stealing a model can cost a fraction of what it takes to actually create it. So when we think of things like the data science resources, the data labeling and data acquisition process, the actual training process taking place on a whole host of GPUs that you can barely find these days because they were once used for crypto miners and are now being used for AI in major companies. The cost of developing these models is huge. So to find out that somebody like me can come along and send a ton of queries to a machine learning model and fine tune maybe an existing model which has a good baseline or what have you, then that's quite a scary prospect. But we've actually seen this play out already before that within the academic context. So researchers at Stanford back, I think it was 2022, but the years are starting to kind of blend into one, created something called Alpaca. And what they did was they took the Llama model developed by Meta and essentially took input-output pairs, so sent stuff in and see what came back out from ChatGPT, and fine-tuned Llama to recreate a version that they felt was comparable for $600. So, I'm sure the OpenAI model cost a lot more than that. Then another crowd came along and did something similar. Vicuna I think it was what they called the project Vicuna, $300 this time. So the barrier and the cost barrier started dropping considerably over time because you can essentially distill models from one another. So that's what we've been seeing within that space. But within the general adversarial ML context, we're seeing attacks on things like cybersecurity products every day. And we have been for many, many years, whether we realize it or not, because of how much telemetry we're gathering through EDR, EPP, XDR applications, and so on. We are struggling to look at it all by eye. So this in turn developed, AI detections. We saw it in previous antivirus companies. We saw it in, network security and every sort of antivirus company today. These things are being attacked. We know that. We lived it at a previous company where our antivirus models were attacked, and our AI engine exploited. And these attacks are happening every day, and also happening in the fraud sphere as well. When submitting a fraudulent payment or a payment in general through maybe a point of sale system or a bank transfer, that, whether you realize it or not, is touching a model. So the model will make a determination on if this is fraudulent or not. So often people conducting fraud or conducting attacks on cybersecurity products are in effect performing adversarial attacks just through a layer of abstraction.
Yeah, a little plug for the MITRE Atlas framework right now. The MITRE Atlas framework is a very comprehensive sort of framework identifying all the different types of adversarial activity and attack types that can be commenced upon an AI system. As part of that framework, they have an example by different technique and tactic that we would encourage you to look at if you haven't become familiar with that before. If you're familiar with MITRE ATT&CK for Endpoint Atlas would be the equivalent for the topics that we're covering today. One of the things that we spend a lot of time on at HiddenLayer is talking about pre-trained models and how to be able to leverage those for innovation, and how to, everybody wants to use those from an innovation standpoint, but also to save on cost from a compute and human resource perspective. In the survey that you'll see in the report, 85% of companies responded that they are using pre-trained models from public repositories. Think of things like a Hugging Face that you might have heard of in the past. Maybe, Eoin, if you introduce the risks that are in those repositories, and then over to the rest of the panel to sort of talk about, what are the real world sort of high consequence risks introduced from that, from a business perspective, I think that would be great.
Sure thing. So yeah, as you touched on, pre-trained models really become an important part today in the democratization of AI, and we're using it in every facet of every company to perform different tasks because we can fine-tune these models without having to spend all that cost I mentioned earlier. Essentially, though, what we can do is, because a lot of these file formats, as Malcolm touched on earlier, are vulnerable and bespoke to machine learning in a lot of cases, they haven't gone through the rigorous vetting or that other file formats and such that we've dealt with over the last few years or the last couple of decades have been. So a lot of these pre-trained models are built upon insecure file formats, and with that can basically be vulnerable to deserialization vulnerabilities. So we can include and harbor things like malware. We've demonstrated it in a few of our blogs over the past couple of years. We even went as far to show a worst case scenario and throw ransomware into a model and have it deployed literally through, I think, 2 lines of Python. as an unwitting data scientist. But a bit broader again, and less on the malware side, these pre-trained models can also harbor what we call a backdoor, but not in the traditional sense. And this is kind of where we are able to train in a piece of like surreptitious logic that when it receives a particular input will give us a nefarious output. So it's like saying, okay, if I have a mortgage loan approval model and I see the name Eoin Wickens in there, well, I'll approve it every time. And that could be a hidden payload in that system. So really understanding provenance and where your model has come from essentially is like super important today. And I can talk more about maybe what we're doing to try and mitigate that later on.
Thank you. Steve, what occurs to me as Eoin is sort of describing that is that there's obvious implications across all industries and sectors, but based on your experience in critical infrastructure, your time in the utility world, what are some of the real world impacts that folks as the CISO and the security personnel of those organizations need to be thinking about, given it's likely that somebody in their organization is downloading these open source models, which have not gone through any sort of security controls in advance?
Yep. So the first thing, remember I talked about unintended consequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's going into here is realize that we're talking about malicious attack, but these same capabilities are also to be able to pick up accidents, right? Which is people don't mean to make a mistake, but they do, and some of the same capability. So understanding that, right? If you look at healthcare, and Malcolm talked about it, which is healthcare is about the exchange of patient data, because we want to make the patient healthy. And that data is important because what does the doctor always say? If you don't tell me what's wrong with you, I can't fix you. And so therefore, we want to trust the data. We want to trust each other and share the information, and we want to trust the systems. And so what we have to make sure is we enable people to do that, because that allows the healthcare system to accomplish its goal, okay? If you look at retail, like at Levi Strauss, right? There was two jobs there from this perspective. One is business data, which is to run the business and figure out how I do that efficiently. But the second part is the consumer data. Because Abigail, if I violate the social contract with you and let that consumer data out, okay, you'll buy jeans from somewhere else. And the business doesn't have a lot of money and it's got to move incredibly fast, okay? So now I'm not worried about securing the company, but protecting the business to enable the business to sell jeans. And so again, there's the attackers, but there's more unintended consequence of data being put into the system that trust is being enabled, decisions are being made, but it's not good data. And then the last is if you look at like PG&E, okay, that's nation state. That's disrupting the social and economic fabric of the country. In that case, it's secure the business, but I have nation state and nation state actors coming at me. And so therefore I really have to lock down systems to make sure that the malicious attackers, which are highly likely, I make it as difficult as I can. So hopefully that helps with use cases.
Absolutely. And thank you. And David, I think you're in an interesting intersection on this one in particular between the data and data infuses basically fine tuning of these pre-trained models and then the security impact. So what are you hearing from customers, or how are they thinking about this? Or what would your advice be to folks that are thinking about either starting to adopt pre-trained models in their environment or already are, and now they're trying to catch up from a security perspective?
Yeah, I'll tell you, when I read that statistic and report that 85% of companies are using pre-trained models, I thought, 15% of the respondents don't have any concept of the fact that their organizations are using pre-trained models, because it's outrageous. It's crazy to not use pre-trained models in the modern era. It's like,
maybe explain that for some of the folks on the call.
Yeah.
Why would that
be? Pre-training a model, I would say Databricks as a company does have a strong investment in making it cheaper to pre-train models, but it is still very expensive, comparatively expensive, and comparatively difficult to build up all of the initial layers of a basic model, which is separate from the kind of the secondary process of fine-tuning it to your specific use case. So pre-training is much more expensive, very powerful, but you can just download a model that is already pre-trained, that is kind of proven in hundreds of thousands of millions of different use cases, and then get going quickly. Which the first time I built an AI system, that's exactly what I did. And I downloaded one model and it worked okay. And I then downloaded a different model that was bigger and it worked much better. And being able to kind of flip that around and try those things out allows you to develop quickly. So I look at that 85% stat and I say, to a certain extent, that stat is probably the bias of the visibility of the people who are answering the questions or something like that, because it just seems so unbelievable that people would handcuff themselves. But we do have customers that I've worked with, or my team has worked with, that have stopped using any external repository, have stopped using Hugging Face because of the security risk. And to my mind, they're falling into the same trap that Malcolm called out earlier, of they're responding so aggressively to a valid security risk that they are instead stopping the organizational productivity. They're saying effectively, you're not going to be productive here. Anybody who's inside of that organization and building AI systems and wanting to try to start doing new things, they're never going to succeed. They're going to either quit or just take a different project or something like that, because you can't be successful without having that jump start. And so being able to get to a point where you can allow your organization to safely use models off of Hugging Face or any of the other type of model zoos is essential. Shout out to y'all on HiddenLayer, which I'm sure you guys will talk about later, about the value of HiddenLayer as a scanning tool for that. It's absolutely essential, because you're killing the productivity of any AI project if you can't do that type of jump start.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Moving to part 3 of the report, advancements in security for AI. One of the main things that I think is important for people to leave this session with is this concept of offensive security tooling for AI. Most of you are probably familiar with Metasploit. We have equivalent tool sets for attacking, obviously not built to attack, but that can be leveraged to attack AI systems. So Eoin, if you don't mind, as the pen testing expert, talk a little bit about the tools, and then maybe Malcolm, I'd love to hear from you as to sort of how you would see the regulatory environment pivoting to protect organizations given these offensive tools. So Eoin, give us the 101.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess adversarial machine learning has been around as a discipline for probably close on 10 years, really. Over that time, we've seen tools that have really taken the academic text and the academic literature and then made that into a tool, such as like IBM's adversarial robustness toolbox. This was done initially to do like defensive and offensive evaluation of your own models. But because they're basically implementing, quite savvy attacks and different white box, gray box, and black box attacks, it's a whole different story. We can use that to leverage. We can leverage that to attack our own models. But then there's other tools as well. There is tools like Counterfeit, which is basically developed by researchers at Microsoft and provides this ease of use abstraction layer on top of adversarial robustness toolbox and QData's text attack, just for completion, to essentially launch attacks in a very similar manner to that of Metasploit. Now, it still requires a bit more prior knowledge, but these attacks are now starting to be very much able to be run from a command line terminal. Then, that's kind of what was around before, but with the eve of large language models and things like ChatGPT taking the world by storm, we started to see tools such as Garrick and LLM Fuzzer and a few others that now allow us to automatically attack machine learning models. And Microsoft's AI red team released Pirate recently for red teaming models using models. There's another tool called Parlay. We're starting to see this really take off. So these attacks are starting to become, just I guess as we have the democratization of AI, we're also starting to have the democratization of AI attack tools as well. And I think that's a real trend that we're starting to see.
And I thank you, Eoin. And Malcolm, before going over to you, I forgot, it wouldn't be fair to not talk about the defensive frameworks before we talk regulatory. So David, as it relates to the defensive frameworks, sort of, maybe read the audience in here on sort of the DA, SAIF, and then other tools and frameworks that maybe they would want to check out.
Yeah, definitely. So the Databricks AI security framework, DASIF, it took us a long time to come up with the thing you could reasonably say, because trying to spell out all the letters is too much. But it actually kind of started. Everybody on the security team at Databricks, we have people who've been doing ML and AI since the beginning, or ML and AI security since the beginning. But a lot of us came from the traditional security world, or the kind of the pre-AI security world. But by virtue of being at a data and AI company, we had to learn how AI works and how it applies to security, and kind of, come from the ground up on how to approach this world. And we actually started doing a series of CISO workshops and trying to take those learnings and then sit in a quiet room of CISOs who also said, I don't really know how this works. Tell me what I need to know. And in doing that, we kind of got to the point that we wanted to build a holistic approach for how these customers, these organizations can deploy and manage AI models safely and securely. And so we built out, one of the guys on my team, Arun, as fantastically detail-oriented execution machine. He enumerated 55 technical security risks in 12 different AI system components, and then figured out what are the security controls that help you address those risks. It's all mapped to other frameworks like NIST RMF, and MITRE, Atlas, and OWASP Top 10 that are also covered in the report that you will have that sent to all the attendees. We also went and got review from organizations like yourselves, and also Meta and CMU and a bunch of others, so that we kind of have industry validation of it. And the idea of the report of DASIF is to make it easy for organizations to kind of get into the world of AI security. And I mentioned at the start that so many of the things are applicable. We know how to do patching, we know how to do code scanning and release management. How do those apply inside of the world of AI? And it's intentionally made it not specific to Databricks. So even for folks who are listening who are not Databricks customers, when the report launches on March 18th, or when the framework launches on March 18th, check it out, because it's intentionally made to be relevant even for folks who are not using Databricks at all. That said, of course, if you are using Databricks, we also did enumerate the Databricks features that map to those risks and those controls to make it easy. So folks, I'll do my shout out. Folks who are listening, March 18th. In the meantime, you can Google Databricks AI Security Framework, and one of the top hits should be the wait list. So you can get a copy of it as soon as it launches. But that approach of kind of looking at these reports, and they're looking at these frameworks and these best practice standards to say, how do I take all the things I already know about security and apply it to the AI world? It's everything for those problems that you don't need a PhD in computer science to try to solve. Being able to make that approachable for folks who are just in an organization who uses AI.
Awesome, thank you. Malcolm, what do you expect to see both from a framework and a regulatory environment, and also maybe what do you want to see? I know you're very active and prolific in communicating with NIST and others, sort of our collective point of view.
Yeah, so let's start with what I'd like to see. I don't want to see regulation that hinders the innovation that can drive social and economic benefit. So good regulation will not hinder innovation. Having said that, if you look historically at where we're at in the cybersecurity industry, we've frankly done a pretty poor job of managing risks. All right, we've been shooting behind it. And so separate from the AI related regulation that we've started seeing, you've seen enforcement actions, you've seen CISO liability, happening with SolarWinds, Uber. You're seeing the SEC materiality stuff. All that from a government perspective is because traditionally we've done a poor job of managing those cyber risks. We've done a poor job of properly informing our investors of those risks and the implications of it. And many organizations have frankly, again, underestimated the risk, under-controlled for it, and therefore we've got this perfect storm of cyber risk that's occurred the past couple decades. Now throw into it AI and the explosive growth of it we've seen in the past few years. What we've seen in the past even 7, 8, 9 months is probably the fastest worldwide efforts around regulation of technology that I've ever seen. And I've been in the tech industry since 1992 when I joined Intel. You've got the executive order that came out last year, actions from NIST. You've got stuff that CISA is doing. You've got the EU AI Act. You've got other stuff abroad, right? So you've got all this frothiness because we frankly have undermanaged traditionally cyber risk. You've got this new set of AI capabilities that has had explosive growth, and all the things that we've talked about in this report. is then driving additional regulation. So you have this confluence of independent related items that are interdependent to drive, hopefully a better response, including just last week, the White House issued an additional executive order around protection of personal information for US citizens. And it was meant to minimize the data that's flowing into what I'd say potential competitive or adversarial countries, ones that are not on controlled country list. So how does Malcolm's personal information potentially wind up in China, Venezuela, other places that might have long-term implications on national security and things like that? Indirectly, as you're collecting data, it's going to feed into AI. So that even that regulatory executive order will have an implication on artificial intelligence, because it's meant to control where my personal information can be used and who can see it and what they can do with it, right? So you have all of that happening. And so that's also another challenge and struggle, not only for the security professionals, but their legal teams to stay abreast of all of it to make sure they're managing it appropriately.
So I'm going to chime in here as a practitioner, right? Because I kind of look at myself as the practitioner with this. And Malcolm and I talk about this, which was there's another thing here, which is the frustration, which is for 5 years, right? We've been investing in security as we traditionally know it and trying to stop the attack, okay? And people understand that security is important, but we're not doing a good job stopping the attacks. And with AI coming in, I think what we're realizing is a lot of people understand the risks with AI. They see how the attacks are impacting them. It has intrinsic value, and so do the governments. And so what you're seeing now, as Malcolm said, is an immaturity in our ability to manage risk, but that's now meeting with the general population understanding Gen AI's risk to society. And now we're starting to figure out how do we start to mature the risk frameworks as well as mature our risk management.
I like that. I think that's optimistic, right? That, Steve, you're intending to be optimistic there. Great. And a great segue to the last prepared section, which is part 4 of the threat report, really talks around predicting our predictions for the space, as well as securing AI. And so we have a number of getting started tips that I'm just going to open it up to the panel to sort of react to: discovery and asset management, risk assessment and threat modeling, data security and privacy, model robustness and validation, secure development practices, and continuous monitoring and incident response. Those are the 6 key components. Open to the panel while we pull up some questions from the audience here in a couple of minutes. What would you add to those categories? Or maybe what's one of those categories you'd like to spend a little bit more time on?
Yeah, I'll just start real quick and go to risk assessments. A lot of folks struggle to identify what the real risk is and where to prioritize. I would say start focusing on the benefit. Where is your organization getting material benefit from artificial intelligence? Use that benefit analysis to then prioritize where you're getting value, because where you're getting value is where there's going to be consequential and material risk.
Thank you.
I might come at it from a slightly different angle then as well. More about if, as a data scientist or a security practitioner who's kind of interfacing with the data science team, I think we should really look, when we're doing risk assessments, to secure every stage of the ML operations lifecycle, from like data acquisition and like understanding where you're sourcing your data from. Like, I think I've used this example before, but you wouldn't want to train up a medical model off subreddit information, for instance. So from that point on, we really need to be careful, right? So if you have like PII, you need to be ensuring that there's role-based access control, that it's really locked down. When you're creating your model, making sure that it's free from malware, or that your pre-trained model that you download from a repository is free from malware, or you know where it's come from. And then even in the deployment phase, we're seeing tons of like zero-day vulnerabilities, and we're finding them within our vulnerability research team here in HiddenLayer. That understanding if the tooling that you're using is safe for purpose, and that's another real aspect that we have to take into account. So I guess I'm saying we need to look at it holistically as well, but just from a kind of ground up approach, I guess.
Thank you.
Cheers.
So again, as a practitioner, data security and data privacy are two different things. Historically, we've worried about data security and we let the lawyers worry about data privacy, and we can't anymore. So we have to embrace both. Now that we've embraced both, then what we have to say is, yeah, and the business needs to move fast. So let's not look at all the ways it's vulnerable. Let's look at the material exploitability. Let's understand what's really important to our business and work with those lines of business to address that risk, and not just try to do it uniformly, because it's just not possible.
Yeah, highly likely, highly consequential. I mean, I think that that's related to Malcolm's comments too on the assessment. It's really to try to follow where the risk is. That makes a lot of sense. David?
Yeah, I'll look at it kind of maybe from the end perspective of, my answer is really do all of those things, because if I'm putting myself in the shoes of somebody who is in security at a, frankly, any size organization, whether it's happening now or in 6 months or in 2 years, but sometime in that time frame, there are going to be teams inside of your organization that are doing things like buzzword bingo of building compound AI systems using RAG and models downloaded from Hugging Face, deployed in-house on your own systems, or in your cloud vendor of choice, or what have you. And as a security team, you have to be ready for that. So you kind of have to do all of those things, because this problem it's coming if it's not already there inside your organization. And so use all of the resources, use the vendors that specialize and have built tools to apply those same frameworks you're familiar with to this AI world, because you can't get away from the problem. It's already here.
Thank you. That's a great way to segue into any questions. I think what we're going to do now is open it up to questions, and I think any second we're going to see a question come across the screen. There we go. What kind of detection should I have my SOC looking at in regards to LLM? Ooh, I would take it, but I took an oath not to do a sales pitch on the webinar. So over to you, Eoin or Malcolm.
Do you want to go for it, Eoin?
Yeah, can do. I'll do the sales pitch. No, I'm joking. Yeah, I think it's a great question. We need to ultimately look at monitoring systems that are live and deployed. We need to look at monitoring our LLMs and understanding what is going in and out of the model, especially considering that, through this medium we call language, we're able to, basically put anything in and get maybe code out, maybe get images out, video out, etc. What we need to start looking for, I believe, and what SOCs need to start looking for, is looking for things like personally identifiable information going in or out of a model in particular situations. If maybe the person who's querying this model is from outside of the corporate environment, also very important there, as LLMs are beginning to become a new data plane. I think that especially, let's say you don't want your model stolen in some instances, maybe you need to look at how often somebody is querying said model. If you have a requester which is dramatically out of sorts compared to the rest or compared to the norm, I think all these things are really important. To do this, you really do have to put in place a monitoring solution, a security product, one of which we do provide under the name of Safe LLM. I'll try and steer too far away from, or not steer too close to doing sales pitches, but that is how I would go about preserving security in your environment.
Thank you. And John, the only thing I would add is, the types of detection categories that we use in our product and sort of map our detection to are both included in the top 10 LLM OWASP framework, as well as the new, if you haven't checked out Atlas lately, Atlas has added some LLM attacks. So we map to those as terms of specific categories. Okay, David. Eoin, do you believe that training data poisoning is having an increased impact on the rise and fallout of prompt injection that you mentioned?
Do I believe that training data poisoning is having an increased impact? I think that if you have bad data, you're going to get a bad model. And that is going to hinder maybe defensive efforts. But typically, a lot of defensive efforts are bolted on to a model, you either have things like content filtering, or you may have, let's say, guardrails through reinforcement. Well, I guess that's reinforcement learning through human feedback. So training data poisoning is just going to produce a bad model. I think the defenses against prompt injection I guess prompt injection has been on the rise because we're all trying to poke these things and see how they're exploitable. I can see maybe more improvements in bolt-on security products than baked in defensive solutions. I think there's a bit of a trade-off. I'm going on a slight tangent here, but we've seen, robustness has gotten us so far with regards to defensive properties of large language models and machine learning in general, but we end up degrading accuracy. We end up degrading the models to a certain level. So I think I'm not answering the question properly, but maybe somewhere in there is an accurate answer.
Thank you, Eoin. And David, you can obviously talk with Eoin after this call. You can just let us know. We can get you on a dedicated session. Bailey, how do you explain the low number of observed AML actual attacks? Does this correlate to an actual low level of threat actors activity? I mean, I think we have a lot of different perspectives on this one, Bailey. I don't know, Malcolm, maybe you take a stab at why we haven't seen everything reported.
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, if you haven't seen it, there's an AI incident database that has tracked over 3,000 reported events. 76+% of those have had real world physical implications. So there's actual data out there. The problem, though, is if you're not instrumented to find anything and scan for things or do detection and response, you're going to miss it because you're not instrumented to find it. And by and large, your existing control infrastructures, as I mentioned earlier, are not looking at the models. They're looking at your operating system. They're looking at, your network and stuff like that. So they're not instrumented to alert you to issues. And so without that, in essence, detection capability, you're going to be blind to things that are already occurring.
I just want to build on that as well. I also think that, when we consider traditional attacks, like I mentioned at the beginning, with things like, fraudulent payments, for example, in a financial setting, or attacks on a cybersecurity product, which is using an AI model underneath, I think that, part of it is a labeling issue as well, right? Like these attacks have and are taking place today also in these environments. So that you also have, as well as Malcolm's point, a slight labeling, a misrepresentation there.
Specific to Gen AI, how are you seeing companies defend against prompt injection attacks? Great question, Anonymous. We go ahead, whomever wants to. Eoin, you want to take that one?
Can do. Yeah, so I think maybe that's the point I was attempting to make at the beginning for the first question. Often we rely on guardrails or different types of things like content filtering or reinforcement learning through human feedback. But if you're using a model that you're deploying yourself, you may not have this built in. So in that respect, we're bolting on security around these models in an effort both to preserve the accuracy of the model and provide a real defensive layer that you have control over, right? Because machine learning models are often a black box that prove hard to understand. When we basically instill or train in defenses, it can also be very much up in the air whether they're effective or not. So for us, and I guess other companies who utilize our products, we are defending against that through a bolt-on security edition.
Thank you, Eoin, and thank you all, everybody, for these great questions. If we didn't get to them, I'll take the action to follow up offline with you directly if you shared your information. This is our final couple of slides. Thank you to all of the authors and contributors to our report and our guest speakers. You can see their names here. We couldn't have done this without you. If you haven't already registered to get the report automatically sent to you, please do so ASAP. You can do it via this QR code right here. Super easy. It's super pragmatic and absolutely worth the time. And this is my pitch. I'd be happy to discuss any of these topics in more detail with you, with any of the folks on this call, as well as anybody else within HiddenLayer. We would be honored to have that opportunity. Please feel free to use that contact information you get directly into me. Thank you so much for your time today.